Okay, we are live. Joining me today is an extra special guest, John Kubie. John, for those who don't know you, could you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, my name is John Kubie. Being about 70 years old, I have a fairly long history. And I'd say when I was starting college, when I went to college, I had two interests. One was biology, the other was psychology. And at that time, in the early 1970s, these were taught totally separately, almost totally. And as a naive student, I didn't know there was any connection between the two areas, and graduated and still was not sure where I wanted to go. And somehow I got the hint, hey, there is an overlap between psychology and biology. And I, after a couple of years gap, started a graduate school program it was called biopsychology then. It was before the term neuroscience was very common.
Yeah.
And so that became, the focus from then on. My research career started working actually in snakes, studying in their olfactory systems, specifically the vomeronasal system. That might seem very strange to someone interested in psychology, but actually leads into the limbic system and some old ideas about the limbic system and reptilian brains. Given a lot of people don't like those ideas, but there's actually something to it that we could go into perhaps later. And this vomeronasal system is also fascinating in its own right. So that was my thesis work. It was actually something I'm quite proud of. It was a funny kind of work where it sort of tested experiments that had been done in the 1930s and using somewhat more modern techniques at that time. We sort of answered the questions. So it sort of ended a line of research because no one is, that's the answer to that question, this system. And so it's nice, but it's not, it's not an particularly active line of work now, at least in snakes. Okay, so moving forward, I was interested in olfaction. I did a postdoc in olfactory physiology with a guy named Dave Moulton at the University of Pennsylvania. But I was really interested in behavior, emotion. Oh, I should have mentioned that I think a core driving thing I wanted to understand was emotion. And I wanted, I was a little screwed up maybe, and I wanted to understand my emotional mess ups, as I think drives many, many people. And that was sort of a guiding thing. So I went to a second postdoc, and that was at Downstate. And I was working with a guy named Jim Ronk, who was my mentor for many, many years. And Jim was an innovator in doing single cell recording in behaving animals and recording single neurons in the brains of rats while they're actively behaving and trying to see if you can make a linkage between behavior and the activity of single cells. And at the time, I went there in 1979. We'll do some history of that field later, I hope. But it was really cutting edge technology, the ability to do it. And it was based on advances in silicon and chips and things like that made it all possible. And my goal, as I said, was to get into the meat of the brain, into the mind, into understanding emotions. And in doing that, Jim was working on the hippocampus. And it turns out I got sort of stuck at the hippocampus and didn't get further into emotions, but it's been a productive area of work. So that was moving into single cell recording in the brain was about 1979. And I stayed in that group really essentially forever. I went from being a postdoc to being a faculty member. I went from collaborating principally with Jim Ronk to another collaborator, a guy named Bob Muller. And Muller and I did, I think, our most cited work anyway in the late 1980s, and moved the field, I think, forward both technically and conceptually. Technically, it was the ability to really do recordings of a sort that people can report them in a way that people could understand what we were doing, rather than sort of subjective. Well, I think the cell fire's over here. We'll get into that later. But in really using computers to collect data and video and things to make somewhat more objective recording abilities. And that was mid 1980s, and it proceeded through the 1990s. And Bob died about almost 10 years ago. And so that obviously that collaboration stopped. And also my active research slowed down a lot. And in parallel with that, I've done a lot of neuroanatomy and teaching. I teach med students and allied health students, other students, graduate students. I enjoy it. That's a big aspect of what I've been doing. And then maybe 10 years ago, I said, geez, I'm interested in the soft dimensions of this area. And one of the soft dimensions people talk about is consciousness. And so I started a group with graduate students, small seminars where we try to think, we're neuroscientists. We should have a handle on something we could have some insight into. So we chose the book Quest for Consciousness. I think, Christoph Koch's book, which was hot, we is still, but it was really the hot book at the time for the neuroscientific basis for consciousness. And we used that as a starting point. And the first great disappointment was the introductory chapter defining what consciousness was. And Koch uses Searle's definition, saying something like, your consciousness is what you have when you wake up in the morning and you lose when you go to sleep at night.
Yeah.
Well, that's not a great handle to get started with. And we went through the book and really liked it a lot. And I learned a lot, but also learned how sort of weak the connections are, or strong and weak, and realized the bumping against the hard problem, which many people have bumped up against. And that was really the beginning of my philosophical journey. I said 10 years ago. I'd like to get the date, but I'm not sure of that. And since then, I've been putting my toe in the water about philosophy, a little bit here and there. Met Richard a couple of times at some odd things in New York City. I'd never taken a philosophy course. I've learned a lot from my daughter, who knows much more than I do. I've gotten to be pretty good friends with Pat Churchland, and she's very, very warm and helpful and smart and knowledgeable, and other philosophers. And so I have spotty background in it. Please don't hold me to formal philosophical standards and understanding of, especially the history of philosophy, where it's so dense and so complicated, and I forget the names of schools and whether it's functionalism or physicalism or illusion. I keep trying to get those straight. Maybe Richard can help in those areas. And so that's sort of where. Oh, and then finally, the last half year, since March, it's going online. That's been a big sea change. I'm a sort of a techie of sorts. I think like Richard, like to try new aspects of technology. And I've been working with my school a lot and had to do remote teaching methods and trying a bunch of other various things, seeing what works and doesn't work. And so that's a recent challenge. Does that get you up to date?
Yeah, that's a lot. That's very much up to date. Thanks for all of that. So there's a lot I want to ask you about in that. You sort of described the journey right there, but I guess I like to start with some of your work, I guess, coming from the 80s and 90s, because I'm very interested in the hippocampus. I don't know if you know this about me, but I worked in a lab for, I've worked in a couple of different labs, but one of them was doing recordings from awake and behaving animals, looking for long-range synchrony between the dentate gyrus and the hippocampal formation and the cortex. So the idea was to put the electrodes in the rats and let them wander around an environment, and then see if there was, some synchronization between them. So, so that's a different aspect, I think, of what the hippocampus is known for. So it's like this, people talk about it. It's important for memory formation, retrieval. It's important for spatial navigation. So the hippocampus is this kind of strange and wonderful place. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what your research was in that area, what aspect you contribute to, and I have some more specific questions too.
Yeah, it's an amazingly broad topic. It's hard to touch on all the ways that hippocampus interacts with interesting things and with physiology and stuff. In fact, I actually don't know what work you did with synchrony, but that's something that I've been seeing more and more about. For example, synchrony between hippocampus and prefrontal cortex and how they talk to each other, with some of the notion being some of the functions we see for hippocampus in rodents may be shared or transferred to prefrontal cortex in primates or humans. Mm-hmm. That's just speculation, but people find that an attractive hypothesis, because most of the work that I think is most successful in the hippocampus is from rats. So we journey back and talk about the start of that work and give a little history.
Yeah, absolutely.
It'll be tricky and I think important to link this stuff to consciousness, but you can't do it just jumping in. I think you sort of have to lay out the story. So give a little more history than people are probably interested in.
I'm interested, by the way.
Okay, Richard and I are interested.
Yes,
anyone else
exactly.
happens to So when I was starting, so if you were in physiology, if you did in rats, it was sort of second rate. If you wanted to do the important stuff, you did in monkey people are mad at this. So, and people were studying, what was well known, and very important marker, is that the Scoville and Milner study in the early 1950s of HM, a hippoleptic patient who had bilateral hippocampal damage.
Yeah.
It was discovered by Milner that he had profound amnesia, just couldn't remember or learn new things. And we won't go into that in great detail. So suddenly it was really a sea change. The notion that there was a small part of the brain that seemed to have a big chunk to do with memory. So that was the, huge landmark event. And so it was thought, if we're going to figure out the biological substrate for this, we have to do it in something very close to humans, monkeys. In addition, it was sort of, more technically challenging and it was harder to do. Most of the real famous physiologists were monkey physiologists. And there was a lot of work done in monkey hippocampus and in addressing the role in memory. And in parallel was some much less work in hippocampus in rats. And let me just mention two groups doing, or maybe three. So there was my mentor, Jim Ronk, John O'Keefe, and Olds, who's well known for self-stimulation. And there probably were some others doing hippocampal physiological work. But maybe significantly Olds and O'Keefe, Olds in particular psychologists, and there was a little bit of condescension among physiologists that psychologists can't really do physiology, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the sense was if the breakthroughs would come through the monkey work, and let's just jump ahead 50 years, and that's not what's happened. The breakthroughs actually seem to have come mostly through the hippocampal work. And that's not due to one group being better than the other or anything, just that's how science works. It doesn't always work in the predictable ways. And we'll get to this. So the important breakthrough, if I hope I'm not skipping anything, is John O'Keefe's discovery of plate cells in the hippocampus.
Yeah.
And to do that, to record plate cells, O'Keefe and Ronk were doing this in parallel in the late 1960s, recording single cell activity in neurons in freely moving rats. And to do that was technically very challenging. It required some microelectronics that was only just then available. I'm trying to remember the name of the chip. The very, this is the kind of FE, field effect transistors were the critical elements that were developed. And O'Keefe and Ronk, in parallel, not knowing each other, started putting these head stages on rats' heads. And this meant that the signal going up a cable would not be cluttered by all sorts of artifacts, and that tiny electrical signals coming from outside of cells and single cells could be sufficiently amplified and clean to record clean action potentials from neurons. And importantly, both of what they both were doing, putting tiny electrodes in rat brains, putting them in a position outside of cells, not intracellular. So being outside of cells, they could faithfully record the action potential trains from nearby neurons. If they had tried, people might say, oh, intracellular is better, it's more sensitive. If they tried to go intracellular, which was technically not feasible, but if they had, that really damages cells sufficiently that you don't get a good record of their action potentials. To get a good record of the action potentials, you have to be slightly distant. So they were interested in the action potential activity of single neurons. And if you put these extracellular electrodes close enough to a neuron, it will be able to record in the extracellular space the voltages produced by the action potentials of that neuron. So the signals are tiny. The typical signal outside of a cell might be 300 microvolts, less than a millivolt, way less than this total amplitude of an action potential. But both these teams and others were able to get good quality recordings. So O'Keefe in 1971, O'Keefe and Dystrovsky was the first recorded paper reporting plate cells in the hippocampus. Now, so both of these groups were working in the hippocampus for, I know why Jim was doing it. I don't know why. I don't really know why O'Keefe was doing what he thought he'd see, but he reported place cells. And it was, if you look at the paper, O'Keefe and Ostrovsky from 1971, the data is not convincing. He said he draws a little schematic of the apparatus they were on and draw little circles where the cells fired. And some trains of action potentials are sort of illustrated on a strip, but it's not that, really not convincing. You have to sort of take his scientific word for it, which now we do because he's a Nobel Prize winner. He wasn't a Nobel Prize winner then. He was a young kid. And so that was, and he said he asserted this was a cognitive mapping system, a huge assertion based on very few cells from a couple of animals, just as wildly thing. So a little background there is the notion that there's a map in rats' brains dates back to Tolman's work in the 30s and 40s and 50s, pure psychological behavioral work, not localized anywhere in the brain. And it was a fascinating duel between camps of psychology about whether rats or had cognitive functions, map-like functions in the brain, or whether they're more SR automatons, robot-like. And so Tolman laid the foundation. O'Keefe sort of picked up on that and said he proposing the hippocampus was where we would find Coleman's cognitive map. Huge leap of cognitive, guesswork. But it wasn't the title of this paper, really amazing. So O'Keefe was both doing these technological advances and these theoretical propositions that were just great but wild. I'll give Jim Ronk some into the picture here. He was doing the same kind of work in the hippocampus, did not clearly see the place cells. He got wind of O'Keefe and went and visited him for a few months, and they became good friends. And slowly Jim got also convinced of the place cell phenomenon. That was maybe a little slow. He always says he takes no credit for it, though sometimes he's given some. So at least these two labs are pushing forward with these techniques. Another important marker, a huge important marker, is O'Keefe and a colleague, Lynn Nadell, published a remarkable book, The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map.
Right.
I think that publication date, 1978. And it laid out this fantastic theory, basically built on Tolman and the place cell findings, still pretty sparse place cell findings. But the theory, laid out a challenge that it's just, Richard, have you read the book? Do you know the book?
Yeah, I do know the book, yes. I haven't read it recently.
So
I know you wrote something about it recently, actually. You wrote like a revisiting of it, so to speak.
Right. So, it starts out with, I think, 80 pages on philosophy and Kant, and why this is the Kantian perspective. Lynn Nadell, who's a terrific psychologist in his own right, balanced O'Keefe terrifically. And that's one chapter. Another wonderful thing that they did, this is maybe the most impressive chapter, was to review the then current hippocampal lesion literature. And psychologists at that time were very fond of making lesions in brains and trying to figure out what the different parts of the brains did.
Right.
And the hippocampus was the target. And there are several theories about what the hippocampus did at the time, things like response inhibition and a few other theories. And what O'Keefe and Nadell did was go through the literature and see if they could reproduce all the deficits in terms of the animals being basically lost in space, unable to find their way around. And they did a remarkable job there. So the original authors never really examined that as a possibility. And they reconciled much of the literature, then existent literature, in this perspective. So it was really terrific. And moving forward, people began to do lesion experiments and sort of confirm this. But at the time, I don't think they were doing any. There was very, very little. And they moved into chapters on physiology, including EEG rhythms, theta rhythm, that kind of thing, and chapters on single unit recording and tying it into human memory stuff to some degree. Okay. Surprisingly to me, they didn't tie it into LTP, learning the plasticity in the nervous system, something that was just recently discovered and they well knew about. I asked them why that wasn't there. Didn't get a clear answer. But so it's this remarkable book in 1978 laid down the framework that I think many of us still work in. There are lots of things that were mistakes. They did have a model of how it worked, not, the very skimpy model and wrong, but they tried. That was an important first step. Is how would neurons really do this? How would this possibly come to pass? And so that's been the start of many models that have come afterwards.
Can you say a little bit about what place cells are?
Okay, what are place cells? So I thought about this recently, and so imagine you're a rat, and you're holding a tiny little Geiger counter, and you're in a chamber. Maybe it's a big rectangular box, and somewhere in the box, someone has put a tiny little bit of uranium. And so you're walking around the apparatus, and when the Geiger counters, that we've all heard it go pop, 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 pop. Right. And so the closer you are to this piece of uranium, the more pops you'll hear. It'll pop, very slow and as you get closer, from any distance or direction the rat is moving, you'll have this popping sound increase. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what a place cell is like. There's no uranium, there's no Geiger counter, but it pops when the animal is near a location in the apparatus. And so that's one cell, and that would be a place cell. And now you take another cell in the apparatus, and we will describe that cell as having a firing field, which is the center of this piece where the uranium was, and it grades off in space. And maybe the size of the field might cover about a quarter of the apparatus. It's pretty big, but it's got a very crisp center. Take another cell, and it will have a firing field somewhere else in the apparatus, and another cell somewhere else. And from very few cells, people made the inference that, well, it'll cover the apparatus. And pretty shortly thereafter, that was discovered, well, across rats and across lots of cells, that seems to be true. Wow. That the firing fields, considering enough cell, will cover the apparatus. So one thing you might think of at first, well, if it's a map, there's to be some topographic organization in two ways. One is if you took this set of cells from one apparatus to another and they all fired together, that the spatial relations across the cells ought to stay the same. Turned out that's not true. And they scatter. I'll get into that in a moment. The other topography you might expect is that if you recorded neighboring neurons in the hippocampus, they're pyramidal cells, the large projection cells. If you recorded one, you go to its neighbor, you might expect that it has a neighboring firing field. Not the case. Pretty early on, people were able to record multiple cells from a single electrode or a few electrodes nearby and see if the fields were centered or localized. It seemed like not at all the case. And the other aspect of going from one apparatus to another, actually, Bob Muller and I think were the first to well describe this. And let me describe our experiments a little bit more detail. This is 1987 published. Going from a cylindrical enclosure to a rectangular enclosure, to a cylinder twice the size and a rectangle twice. So the animal's very familiar with these apparatuses. It walks around. The behavioral task, by the way, almost certainly is not dependent on the hippocampus. The rats we tried to get them to explore the space and randomly drop food pellets to different locations. And I don't know the experiment's ever been clearly done, but you damage the hippocampus, that behavior is not disrupted. The goal was really just to get the animal exploring all parts of the environment. And it's somewhat interesting that this hippocampal system seems engaged spatially, even when the task is not spatial. So getting back to the data here is what we saw with going from, let's imagine we were able to record a few cells at a time in the small apparatus, the small cylinder, taking the rat to the small enclosure, what we would just see would something like, if we're recording 3 cells, 2 of them might become totally dead silent. The third one would go to a location we could not predict. And maybe 1 or 2 other cells would suddenly be seen as active, having their own firing fields. So, and then the same kind of thing going from one apparatus to another. If the apparatuses are somewhat similar in shape, there's not that radical change. It's sort of some of the cells change, some don't. But if they're sufficiently different, you get what's we called remapping, now commonly called global remapping. Wow. And it leads to the idea that the hippocampal map, if you want to think of it that way, is unique to each environment the animal's in.
So you have to make a new map every time you change the environment.
Right. it's a system that's capable of holding multiple maps. And then it gets up to the complicated issue: how many maps can it hold? Is that in cases where the hippocampus is damaged, would the mapping system fall down, and would they fall apart, and how, all those sorts of issues, the capacity and things. These are fascinating questions which are just not clearly answered even now.
Yeah.
But the idea of multiple maps.
The idea is that, so first of all, the idea of a map, the place cell with the buzzing and whatnot, this is mapped onto the environment, irrespective of the animal's body position in the environment and that sort of
yes
thing.
And no. Yes and no. To a first approximation, yes. In a large 2D space of this sort, yes. If it's an alleyway kind of situation, they're highly directional.
Okay. So if there's a lot of vertical places.
Not vertical. No, I meant, so if the animal's running one direction in an alley in the other direction, it probably only fire when the animal's going one direction.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So what some of the original studies were in what's called radial arm mazes or 8-arm mazes, which have lots of alleys. And those, when the animal's in the alley, it's highly directional. When it's in the central platform, it's omnidirectional.
Okay. And these are the same cells?
Same cells, right.
Okay.
That's a confusion. To me, the omnidirectionality is more impressive and surprising. Right. And that was what was first described. The directionality, can't quite explain it. You could, as your point is suggesting, the animals sort of in a sense have to learn these when we go put into a novel environment, the whole thing doesn't spring up immediately.
Right.
It looks like a few cells spring up and then over time it crystallizes. But this suspicion I would have is that in an alleyway, it's a partially learned. Perhaps there's no utility into knowing the same place if it always ends in two different directions. I don't have a good answer for that, either functionally or physiologically. But that's basically what we've seen.
Okay.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about direction, because there's a whole another. So my mentor, Jim Ronk, who I talked about earlier, his most famous finding is head direction cells.
Yeah.
And so head direction cells are recorded not in the hippocampus. We don't have a figure, but the hippocampus is one region of the rat brain. It's a primitive cortex, or an older cortex with simpler organization than neocortex. Adjacent to it are a few transitional cortical zones, and then there's neocortex. If you go to these transitional cortical zones, frequently what Jim started doing was exploring these transitional zones. And in one of them, he found these cells called head direction cells. Mm-hmm. And head direction cells are sort of the orthogonal or totally different from place cells, where a place cell to first approximation fires in a place irrespective of direction. The head direction cells fire with direction irrespective of place. And it's important to point out that direction is not direction with respect to the animal's body. It's direction with respect to the outside world. And you might think of it as a compass-like direction, but it's not magnetic compass, because if you rotate the environment, the whole thing rotates. But if you record where the cell fires in different parts of space, it's always parallel vectors, as if it's a compass pointing that direction. And the head direction cell signal, it's hard to give you guys a sense of it. The place cell signal is really robust, but the head direction cell signal is more robust. And whenever you record firing of cells in the brain, you say, is that really what it's interested in? Maybe there's some correlate that's stronger or better. We're just missing the essence. And that argument can sort of be made for place cells. It cannot be made for head direction cells. They respond like a sensory receptor. They're totally predictable responses. There's no room, basically no variance, no room for another signal to piggyback on. So that's a separate system, a separate signal. And if you're creating a navigational robot, these are two good signals to have. You can't really, even knowing where you are, if you don't know what direction you're heading, you're not going to get towards your goal. And if you have to know both to begin heading out. So
what are the ideas about how the system computes this axis so that the vectors go along? Or in other words, how does it stay
that's primitive. I think there's a lot of description of how these, the basic behavioral properties in different environments and the sensory inputs, but how they downstream compute behavioral trajectories is much less far along, and how they and the neuronal computational dynamics is not well understood. Really how the neurons compute one thing from one step to another. Surprisingly big challenges. You could blame the community, but I think that's not fair. It's just the challenges that O'Keefe laid out 50 years ago, or was it 50, whatever the number of years ago, are bigger than people suspected.
Yeah.
And I think there is a lot of progress, but it's in smaller steps.
So one of the things
that outline. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say one of the things that I'm really interested in is this: the way that various signals from these neurons may be interacting with more global EEG signals, like the theta rhythm, which we hear a lot about the way these signals are nested in the theta, and the way that theta may operate to synchronize activity.
Can I sidetrack that question for a second?
Yeah.
There's one other cell type that embarrassed if I don't introduce, and that's grid cells.
Grid cells.
They're very famous. Was it the turn of the 21st century? The Mosers group in Trondheim discovered grid cells.
Yes.
So I described place cells earlier as having this one firing field. I mean, usually some of them they have a couple, but they're sort of random with respect to each other. The Mosers and their students and postdocs recording in the entorhinal cortex, in the medial entorhinal cortex, discovered a new surprising cell type. And they, in the sense, they're place cells in that they fire in specific locations in the environment. But instead of having a single bump or a random second one, the pattern of the bumps is incredibly regular, and it creates a grid-like arrangement. It's roughly a hexagonal grid that covers the environment. So amazing discovery. Early on, it was thought, reasons probably relevant right now, thought that, if we just add these grids together, if they're out of phase, and so we just add them together, that would produce a place cell. And it would, computationally. But it doesn't seem it works out that way. When you wipe out the lesions to the grid cell system, the place cells sort of change a little. It's not a simple story. So that's one of the, I think, blind alleys is the simple ideas of how these things could be extracted from one from another don't work out that well. But the grid cells are real, real important. The general notion is they contribute to something called path integration. That is using your own path to understand where you are in space, the history of your movements. That's a whole another sort of complicated story, but the grid cells have to tie in. By the way, the grid cell area, the medial entorhinal cortex, projects right into the hippocampus, and so really feeds in. Anatomically perfect. The idea that the place cells would come from grid cells seemed like it had to be true. It's not so simple. It doesn't work out. That kind of thing.
Unfortunately, so let's get back to never quite that simple.
The oscillation story.
I would. Part of me is wondering, because I know the Mosers have introduced some of this stuff, and there's other, work that relies on this too. But what the picture that you get is kind of that there are that information can be broadcast in some sense, or carried or tuned into by different systems in the brain by using these different oscillation frequencies. Is that too much of a metaphor reading into the way the brain is functioning? Do you think, or do you think that's
no? But I think it's not well enough understood to get really into it. And plus, I'm not probably the one to tell the story. But I think there's a general notion that different areas have to coordinate and get synchronized in some fashion. Single cells don't produce any signal that's of use to an animal with billions of cells. They have to synchronize in some way. And it takes a collection of cells to get to the behavioral endpoint. And to some degree, oscillations organize and collect information from one region to another. And there's multiple different frequencies that are important. I mean, it seems like a bunch of signals coordination frequencies that are going on in parallel, in sense, multiplex is the term. So you get low frequencies coordination, and at the same time, high frequencies coming through, carrying apparently a different signal, but not interfering with each other too much. And then sometimes these things interact with each other But yeah, I think that the oscillation stories are widely pursued. That generally assume that for areas to communicate effectively, their neurons have to get in sync with each other. And how that works is a big issue. And one, I'm just not the best person to give you metaphors or ideas or where things are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so how does this story that we're talking about, because this is sort of what I started off asking you about at the beginning, was it seems like you hear these two stories about the hippocampus and its related areas. So the one is the story that we're talking about, how important it is for spatial navigation. There are place cells, grid cells, head direction cells. And then the other is this story about from HM that, it seems to have this role in encoding long-term memories, which is why maybe you were surprised that LTP wasn't mentioned in the early book or whatever. But so they seem like different stories, but yet they focus on the same set of structures. And I don't hear much about that in the story of place cell grid cells, right? There's not a lot of the.
Right. I think that everyone in the place cell grid cell world understands that those two stories have to be merged. It's just not reasonable to think that the same structure does two totally different things, or does one thing in rats and does something totally different in humans. The organization is so identical and things
Right.
of that sort. Plus, more recently, people have found place cells in humans. It's technically difficult. Usually, they're patients lying in bed waiting for surgery or something like that, so you can't have them run through mazes. But the phenomenon, it doesn't seem like it's a rat-specific thing. Just rats are convenient. Right. And then they might the question: do rats have episodic memory? Which is maybe we'll head a little bit. But yeah, so the treasure at the end of the rainbow is to merge these two lines of thought. Now, there is a sort of a midway theory. I would sort of call it pioneered most by Howard Eichenbaum, which is that the place cell system is part of a more general system that's all about just relations and associations. And focusing too much on the spatial thing is missing the main feature. I'm not of that thing. I think the place is fundamentally important. The system is evolved and organized to do, and my guess is to do spatial tasks. And the other things ride on top of this basic ability. Rather than thinking there's a more general ability that came to pass, we can see the spatial nature of it most easily because of the way we do the techniques. I don't really think it's useful to get into a debate about that, but I still think that the spatial thing is the fundamental thing, and it's not secondary to some more general thing the rats are doing. If we generalize, what I would say is that what the spatial navigational system gives you is a two-dimensional interactive system. So it really has reduced dimensionality, and it can compute associations and trajectories and paths across a two-dimensional representation. Functionally in evolution, two-dimension, if you think of the animal behavior and somewhat more primitive animals and long ago in time, getting around in space is a real important thing. It's knowing where the food is, where your nest is, where danger places are, having a somewhat map of your environment to these things. This is not some abstract ability. This is real life and death and evolved function. And there are fascinating things about what once animals began to locomote. They develop brains, and animals that don't locomote don't have brains. And even animals that locomote and then early parts of their lives and then become sessile, I think is the word. Then they sort of play, their brains disappear. It's sort of, locomotion and finding your way around is a core behavioral function. And so I think that my guess is that's the core. And understanding it will lead to insights about maybe more abstract uses of the same cellular machinery.
That's interesting. So your idea would be that the spatial stuff is really important for survival, but then the episodic memory stuff may be a kind of offshoot of that in some sense.
No, maybe an offshoot, but I'm not sure how distant an offshoot, but linked to it. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. So because would it be do you think the hippocampus has any role in planning possible trajectories? Is that one of the things?
Oh, that's a good lead-in question. I love it. That's so maybe the background for this is to give a little undergraduate philosophical framework that comes
Sure.
from Daniel Dennett. And I think, if I remember correctly, he has a book in the early mid-90s, Kinds of Minds. And he
Yes.
talks about 4 kinds of minds. I think I can remember the name. I use this a fair amount, so I sort of remember it. So there's the Darwin. So Dennett's terminology is the ability to do cute tricks, be able to do fancy behavior and what it takes to do fancy behavior. So the lowest level creature that can do fancy behavior has a Darwinian mind. That is, its ability to do fancy behavior tricks is totally inherited from its parents and its ancestors. It develops over eons and multiple generations. The second, somewhat more fancy creature is a Skinnerian, I think he calls it, where they can do trial and error during their lifetime and evolve better behaviors as they're by trial and error. And so it's not just your ancestors learning slow learning across eons. It's learning within a lifetime. The third level he calls, who to give credit to, he names these all by
Popperian.
Yeah, thank you, Popperian. So Karl Popper gets the credit, and that's doing not having to do trial and error in real time, but doing it through imagination. If I go there, what will happen? If I take this route, what will happen? If I do that route, what will happen? And he has a quote from Popper about how many animals' lives saved by not going off cliffs and things like that, and just doing it in its mind. So that the level 3 creatures, that is my favorite, and it's what I think is going on in the hippocampus, is taking imagined routes through space to see what the optimal route is. And I think where there's fascinating evidence of these imagined trajectories. And wow, now I have to remember the name of the authors of the study I like. There are several studies that examine this. I'm blanking the authors' names, as I frequently do. But,
I can put a link afterwards when you remember later.
They may come up to me a little bit. So basically what they did was, actually the design is a little complicated. They trained rats to go to food. They had multiple food wells in a big environment. And during a single behavioral trial, the one food well was baited and could be rebaited. And so they knew during the day task which the rats would know what food well was the baited one. I get this correct. And they also baited around the edges. This is a little complicated design. So the rats would go between the one in the middle that's hard to find and the one around the edge that are fairly easy to find. They have to alternate between those two goals. And and they were recording hundreds of hippocampal neurons. So when you record hundreds of hippocampal neurons, you can make a good guess of what the animal's representation of it is, exactly where it is, any place in the environment. So through a Bayesian decoding scheme, they can say, oh, the animal, and they beautifully showed that the animal's representation of where it was tracked really where the rat was, virtually anywhere in this large space.
Wow.
You can only, one cell at a time, you can only tell when it's in that one field. But if you're recording hundreds, you put all this information together, you make a good guess of where the animal hippocampus is pointing to, and where the animal thinks it is, in a sense, or our guess of where the animal thinks it is. Okay, so that's the background. So what do? The animal, the task further is it's alternating between the location, the goal in the middle of the apparatus and going around the edges. And what they find is when the animal finds food around the edges, it then has to figure out what's the best path to get to the goal. And since the location it finds around the edges vary from time to time, it's not always the same path. From trial 1 to trial 2, they have to compute a different optimal path to get to this goal location. And what does the rat do? The rat, when it finds food at the edges, doesn't immediately scurry towards the goal. It seems to pause and go out of a locomotor pattern and rear and look around a little bit. And during this look around behavior, there are very rapid trains of action potentials. And this was a phenomenon discovered by Yuri Bazaki, is that during these so-called sharp waves, the sharp waves are the EEG waves, riding on the sharp waves are very rapid trains of action potentials. And you see the sharp waves when the animal pauses and rears, And you can, if you're very careful, record the trains of action potentials. And what this study's authors, I'm still struggling for, did was they watched these sharp waves when the animal was scanning the environment, presumably trying to figure out a best route to get to the goal. And on successive sharp waves, they would play out what you could call a path. That is a sequence of action potentials that represented place cells that would take the animal from where it currently was to one part of the apparatus. And with successive sharp waves, different paths emerged, going different places. And one of the paths would take the animal very close towards the goal. And then the animal would go down and follow a behavioral path very close to the imagined path. So this is not a perfect experiment. It didn't, it wasn't exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive though.
But it's what we imagine. I imagine is going on. The animal's sitting there, and it's in the periphery. If I go there, will I find the goal? If I, very quickly going through these internal simulations of paths and determining whether they're effective ones or not. So I think that
so just to clarify, to make sure I understand. So what I know about the sharp wave. So you're saying nested in the sharp waves, there's a burst of action potentials. The neurons which are firing those action potentials represent place cells.
Yes.
So that the firing pattern indicates like a possible
there would be
sequences
along an executed path if the animal were to execute a path. And exactly.
I mean, that's really quite amazing when you think about it, that you can find that clear evidence of that happening.
Right. That's right. It's mind blowing. Now, is it a perfect study? Are there flaws that you could argue about? Yeah, you could see them. But technically, recording, as I was saying, hundreds of place cells is incredibly challenging in a behaving animal. And training the task and getting the recordings, it's a very, very impressive study. I sort of wish I could remember the names of the authors, but being over 70, sometimes this happens. I'll send it to you afterwards.
Yeah,
you can fill it in. Okay, so but doesn't sit alone. There are others that I don't find quite as as extraordinary, but that's the general notion, is that riding on the sharp waves are trains of action potentials that represent paths, but they're not paths that are during execution. They're paths that are somewhat like episodic memory.
Interesting. So you could see the bridge between there and some kind of episodic memory or mental time travel or something like that.
So let's take when else do you see these trains of action potentials? So now take the same rats and put them to sleep. Let them sleep. Not put them to sleep. Let them sleep and record from their brains. And there are various patterns of sleep, the sleep stages and stuff. And during some stages of sleep, different things emerge. During some stages, these trains of action potentials occur, which are relatively slow and sort of in real time. In other stages, these sharp wave-like trains occur. The interesting thing is the trains of action potentials come very close to representing real trains that had been observed in the animal in its previous waking episode.
Right.
And if you think about random processes, if you would randomly identify cells in the hippocampus, they would never make, a string of 10 cells fired would never make a real path. There's just too many possibilities. And certainly not a real path in the behavior in the apparatus the animal recently was in. Yet what's seen is something close to the real paths in the recent behavior. So there's this idea of replay during sleep, which closely parallels that pre-play during exploration. And one can think, it doesn't take a big stretch of imagination, is that replay during sleep is, let's say, is linked to, if not, episodic memory.
Right, so like a consolidation process, so you could link it to that.
Well, that too. So it's also part of a process that selects what aspects of my recent experience I'm going to consolidate and store for future, and what aspects will let them disappear. So it both is a replay. So the very, very fast replay doesn't seem likely to be episodic. It's just too memory, episodic memories don't occur that quickly. But the slow perhaps is episodic memory. But it becomes a model or a substrate of how we can begin to think about it. And so paths through space are much like episodes in episodic memory. And we can, because we have this ability to know where the animal was at one time during its recent experience, we can call that a real path.
So is there, I mean, this is something I don't know, really know a lot about, but is there any work that uses maybe like optogenetics or something like that,
Yeah.
which can like get some of these things to fire at will, so to speak, and maybe would the animal navigate in that way if you recreated some of these patterns optogenetically or something like that?
You're challenging me. So I'm a Twitter user. I think you are also.
Yes.
And Twitter's become my way of sort of most efficient way of tracking recent publications. And I think I get about 2 or 3 relevant hippocampal publications per day. Is a pretty active field.
Yeah.
And with my amnesia, I don't store them all so well. Yeah, so there's a lot of work with optogenetics. I can't think of anything that is quite as strong as you're suggesting, and
Okay.
some of them really seem like failures. But yeah, there's a lot of work in that regard. There's a
Okay.
lot. I think maybe combined with that, or more exciting, are some of the optical recording methods. So much earlier in our talk, I talked about the single unit recording with electrodes,
Right.
where I sort of inferred you could maybe get 2 or 3 cells at one time if you were real good. And so the electrode recording methods have progressed a lot. And in the studies that have done most recently, they may have gotten up to hundreds of electrodes, recordings with fancier electrode techniques and putting more electrodes in the brain and all sorts of things like that.
These are all
But the
micro
new
arrays though, so they'd all be like
macro
yoked together.
arrays, right, and edges of silicon chips and things of that sort. The the big change, I think, is optical recording. And as far as I know, so far it's done only in mice, where you expose a region of the hippocampus from above and put a video camera, tiny little video camera mounted on the animal's head, and use calcium imaging to see which cells have high spikes in calcium. Now, calcium spikes are not the same as sodium spikes. They're really different, but they're much slower. You get this increase in calcium apparently when there are a whole bunch of sodium spikes than traditional action potentials. But so these calcium pulses can be used as a marker for, maybe you get 1 calcium pulse for 10 quick action potentials. So when the animal is in the middle of the firing field, you'd imagine that would give you 1 calcium spike. So with these microscopes mounted on most mice heads, they can view fields of thousands of neurons.
Wow.
And they can watch the calcium spikes in videos. And there's a lot of advantages here if they truly represent what the electrodes were recording. Among them, are you recording thousands? Second, you know the spatial relations across the cells. See if that original topology may have been something there. And third, they apparently can record for months, or maybe a month, long periods of time, recording the same cells over and over again. So these things together with the advances in the electrophysiology, where you can put hundreds of electrodes, or the imaging technology where you can record thousands of neurons and seemingly similar dependent variables. These are, let me just call it promising. They produce some important results, but mostly they're, show that the techniques are there to really do new sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, so that's very interesting. I mean, obviously the more technological things that we have, the better that we're at. But I mean, to get back to this point about the relation of memory to the hippocampal spatial stuff, would you have bilateral hippocampal lesions? Do you also find deficits in spatial navigation? I mean, HM was able to walk around and stuff, but he wasn't able to.
With animals, certainly. They're just, they can use landmarks and things like that. So go towards a post or something of that sort. But to do this map-like computation, they're lost. And the most famous apparatus for that is the Morse water maze. This was developed, I think it was about 1990, something like that. And it seems a very elegant task. For people who may not know, it's a large, 6 or 10 foot diameter swimming pool. There is a hidden platform surface a couple inches or so below the surface. The water is made opaque with something so the animal can't see the platform.
Right.
And the animal is, through just a couple of training trials, put into the apparatus, and it swims directly to the platform. The rats swim pretty well, but they don't like the water, so it's a so they learn very quickly to swim towards the platform and get there. And they take very linear paths, even though they're starting from different start points. Why is it better than other things? Well, the goal is not marked. It's in no way a landmark. They can't follow a single landmark on the wall or something. Say, follow that. And it's hidden, and the paths are unique. So it's very, very widely used in an elegant design to show a map-like navigational strategy.
I mean, you can, if you want, put landmarks in the background or on.
Oh, there's lots of things you can manipulate.
Right.
Them. Yeah. And then you can test memory and short-term memory and long-term. You can trialing over days, within days. There's lots of ways of manipulating this, and every imaginable thing has been tried, I think.
Can you do that with when I guess you could, when the animal has electrodes implanted for recording, like while it's
very hard. Could I confess something? I think I can confess. I think I may have reviewed one of the Moser's very, very first papers where they were trying to do electrophysiology in the water maze. Makes a lot of sense. These are the two. Not a great paper. The big problem is you can't get the animal to sample all parts of the space. So you can't create a map, the map-like representation that was done earlier. And so it's not been much pursued. Going back decades to our original study, but also current work, to get these place cell maps, you have to have the animal walking across the environment for tens of minutes and lots of sampling of all regions of space. Otherwise you won't have a good, and there are problems with that as well. There's a variation from past to past and all sorts of things of that sort. But the water, recording in the water is not a very good way to go.
Okay.
Plus the can short and stuff like that. But then that's not the obstacle. The obstacle is the animal can't explore the whole water maze.
Okay. So, but sorry, I sort of sidetracked you from your original point, which was about the use of the water maze.
Okay. Yes, the water maze, elegant design, and so. Early on, I think the Olton's 8-arm maze was a very popular design. There's the Barnes maze, which is a good design. The water maze is elegant. There are other ones. Richard Morse develops these beautiful mazes coming out every year or so. But the water maze is sort of the landmark. This is sort of the gold standard, I think. The task is, how do you create a behavioral apparatus that will show the animal couldn't be using a strategy other than a cognitive mapping strategy?
Right.
And that's the challenge. That was Tolman was trying to do, many, many decades ago. And with every task you design, people can say, well, they could have been doing it this way. That's a trick they could have learned. It wasn't quite as fancy as you were making it out to be. And so the goal is to design a task that would be very hard for an animal to use without a cognitive map. And then to show that if you disrupt the part of the brain that seems to be the cognitive map, then the behavior is disrupted. And that's what the water maze accomplishes, I think.
Yeah. And so this is, and in one of the ways, the thing about this is it's a huge success story, obviously, from cognitive neuroscience. Trying to take some function like this, localize it, carefully rule out all sorts of counter examples and possible other mechanisms. And so this idea that there's a cognitive map at hippocampus has really stood the test in the way that you expect good science to. So I guess it was partially recognized with the Nobel Prize, or is that the way you see it?
Yes, yeah. So what was it, 5 years ago or so?
Yeah.
John O'Keefe and the Mosers shared the Nobel Prize, and it was for this work. I was a little disappointed the way it was advertised, and a little bit in the way their talks are beautiful talks, but they never talk about learning. About HM. They don't go that far. They talk as they think it was advertised as the hippocampus is a GPS system.
Yeah.
Yes, as far as it goes, but they don't take it one step further. And I think what you and I are trying to do is, and others, is trying to take the one step further to see how it links to other cognitive functions. And there we're not as far along, but that's I think why I'm talking to you in something called consciousness now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, that naturally segues into what I was going to ask you about anyway. But so, in your view, who's reading this map out? So these neurons
Ooh.
are connected to
Oh, the little
who?
man in the brain, don't you know?
Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
one.
Where's the signal being sent to, and what systems are making use of it?
That's a really, I don't think I can answer the question very, very happily. I can make stabs at it, and sometimes they are better stabs than others, and I'm not sure what stab is going to come forth. But it's how do you get from there to behavior?
Right.
And so maybe I should backtrack and talk about my thoughts about consciousness a little bit, because I think these are two things that we want to get to merge.
Yeah.
So my perspective on consciousness is that it has to have behavioral functions, or I'm not interested in it. It has to, because if it doesn't have behavioral function, it cannot be an evolved function. It can't be something that's of utility to the organism. And that's sort of some, thing. But where I stand, here I stand.
Well,
If
let
it
me
doesn't
stop you
have
right there for a
utility,
second.
yeah.
So what's the it here?
What?
You say if it doesn't have utility.
Consciousness.
So what's
consciousness.
it?
If consciousness doesn't have an outlet to behavior, it can't. That means to me it doesn't have a function. And if it doesn't have a function, it can't have a behaviorally evolved function. And let me just say, I'm not interested in it. I'm only
But
interested in consciousness.
what do you mean by consciousness is what I mean. So in this
Whatever
context.
wherever we come to mean by consciousness, we have to move backwards a little bit. I'm not sure we'll get there. But the system I would like to try to understand is a high-level system that leads to behavioral flexibility, and we find that we introspect about consciousness, it has a lot of these features.
Yeah. So, because I mean, for my personal perspective, I think the question of whether consciousness has a function is an open question.
Okay.
So I wouldn't want to define it into the concept of consciousness. Because
okay, I'm only going to pursue the other fork. And the fork that it has no output, no function. I'm just not going to pursue it.
So what's the reason for doing that though?
Because it's not as interesting.
Time is limited and stuff, but
well, I mean, free will and all those sorts of things, and I maybe my optimistic bias that my mind is meaningful is not just an epiphenomenon. That's if I have to, I only have so much I can do with my life, and if I don't want to pursue things that I think are uninteresting, and that's
but you don't want to pursue dead ends either and rule out possibilities simply because.
But I think this channel hasn't been pursued sufficiently.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me what you mean by that. What's not been pursued?
Okay. So we've gotten as far as thinking that there's a system in the hippocampus which can look at possible executed behaviors and choose the optimal one.
Right.
Okay. So let's call that deliberation. So I think that's the core function of consciousness, is deliberation. Now, whether the hippocampal system is the consciousness deliberation system or not, I'll leave open-ended. But I think examining possible alternatives and choosing an optimal one is a pretty important function. And I'll say that deliberation. I'm not going to say it's the only function, but it's a core function of consciousness.
Yeah. So what you're saying then is that it can't happen unconsciously?
Oh, aspects can certainly happen unconsciously. There's lots of ideas of how these imagined outcomes occur in lower level motor systems, the cerebellum and other places. But that's why I would not say for sure that the hippocampus is the consciousness system. But I'd say just introspectively, that fits what I think my consciousness is good for.
Yeah. But so my question though was whether you think that can be done without consciousness. So could you have a system that can engage in that sort of behavior, like a navigational robot?
And I think I can't challenge that at all. I think it certainly could be done. I think you could make a robot that did what you'd call deliberation and selected optimal outcome, projected to the future in some fashion. Would it be conscious?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll leave that to you philosophers to decide that.
Well, that was kind of my question to you, because if you're going to build into the notion of consciousness that's functional at this usefulness prescription, then you sort of have to say that thing is conscious. or you have to explain what it is about what you have to add to something like that to get consciousness. In which case you'll sort of be on my end of the spectrum, wondering what the function of consciousness is.
I can't
Since in
come
that
up with a
case, you could,
feature.
if you had a system that just deliberated unconsciously, and then added something to it that then gave it consciousness, like whatever it is, a certain biological state or a certain higher order awareness or whatever, then the idea is that the usefulness to the animal comes from all the stuff that was unconscious. So it'd be just as useful unconscious as it is conscious. And so the usefulness is something over and
even
above.
within the framework, this is not so, I'm not such an expert on, but even within the framework of conscious decision making, there's all sorts of evidence of unconscious biases. When people go to a grocery store and choose what's on the right side of a shelf, people study this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't question that there are unconscious biases in this deliberative process, or there's unconscious aspects of the deliberation.
But it's not just that there's aspects, it's that deliberation itself could be unconscious, the whole process.
Yeah, it could all be unconscious. I can't, say it's not possible. But now we get to the other side. Introspectively, it seems like it's conscious. When I deliberate, I'm aware of the alternatives, and I seem to select the one that I think is going to be most beneficial.
Right. But that doesn't mean that's the core function of consciousness, since if it can happen unconsciously, then the usefulness is something that's independent of being conscious. It could be there with consciousness. It could be there without consciousness.
Well, I think it can add qualia to this argument as well. The philosophers that I've read about seem to separate two mysteries of consciousness, qualia and free will. My guess is that when people move closer to understanding things, those won't be so separate. That there shouldn't be two mysteries in something. That let's just see if we can solve it with one. I link qualia closely to motivation, and motivation closely to having this. I think we skipped perhaps too rapidly ahead in our discussion.
Let's back up.
Let's back up a little bit and move to the notion that these hippocampal paths are paths through single maps, but the animal has multiple maps in its brain. Right. So right now I'm in my computer room. If there's a map, maybe I'm not constantly a map of the computer room, but I don't have right now a map of my office or my route to work or anything like that. There's one going on at a time. And let's make a hypothesis guess. That's my current conscious framework. And I think the paths that I would compute are specific to that framework. And I think we can look into the hippocampus and see evidence for that. That's what I'm saying. When the animal exhibits these paths, they're specific to the framework the animal previously was awake in. It's not all the possible previous environments the animal had been in.
Yeah, that would not be useful.
Right. They're both useful. So and I think that corresponds, and I can only make a correspondence. I can make a demonstration to the way this conscious deliberation process works out. It's framework dependent, and other people might call it context dependent. And I like the word context, and I've tried to use it in terms of these map frameworks. They represent context, and people in neuroscience use the term context in various ways, but I think of them as single maps represent behavioral context. They represent the realm of opportunities that are possible now, and I don't want to think about all the other possible things. Okay. So they're an opportunity space of some sort. And so the episodic memories, the possible paths, all of those things are embedded in a context, in a framework. And I see this as mapping pretty nicely onto conscious processes, that they are framework dependent.
So what I'm offering is like a conceptual challenge to that. So the idea is that if you agree that these things can be done without consciousness, and there's not only evidence that there's unconscious biases, but there's evidence that deliberative processes are more rational by some definition of rational in terms of self-interest when they're done unconsciously, when you have a distracting task and you have to make judgments about a mortgage. your judgments about which mortgage to pick are actually better in terms of interest rates and that thing when you don't have time to consciously deliberate, but you're distracted by this task that you have to perform, as opposed to the control group, which was given explicit arguments favoring certain of the mortgage packages. So they make worse off decisions than the people who have to make these distracted decisions. So that seems, I mean, you could interpret that. It's not the cleanest study, and none of this is, but you could interpret that. One plausible interpretation of that is that the deliberative process is better when you're not bogged down in conscious deliberation.
Yeah, I would put a different framework. So,
okay, go ahead.
And because your sort of automatic processes are not deliberative. And there's a lot of, this is again, not my area, but I sort of like it a lot. There's a notion of model-based and model-free decision-making.
Right.
And model-based decision-making are sort of these, what we're talking about, this hippocampal deliberative processing. Model-free is more like SR, stimulus response, where you're not deliberate, you're not evaluating alternatives, you're just doing a computation that seems efficient and gets you the right goal. Sometimes it's actually better. There's, that's what you're saying in the example you had, that sometimes the interest rate computation is better if you're not really thinking about all the alternatives or weighing in what your vacation, whatever different things are going on. It's
well, what I said
faster
was that
and
you're
better.
not consciously thinking about them, but
Right.
the claim was that you were still thinking.
Well, I think in the way I dissociate, it's not, I think the task you have is a mix of deliberation and unconscious thought. What I think of as habit versus deliberative action. So habit actions frequently are faster and better than deliberated actions. And
Right.
So the model for habit actions I think of is driving along a very, very familiar route. I think a lot of people sort of think about this. So I take a long drive to and from work every day, and it's clearly sensory response. I got visual inputs that are being processed. I'm turning and turning, but they see it, having done it so often, it seems to be embedded in a habit system. And
Right.
I can have a conversation while it's going on. I can think about problems at work and things like that, and do a pretty efficient job. I haven't crashed yet of getting to and from work. And arguably better than if I'm really concentrating. And some people argue that these action-based systems are more efficient and faster.
Right.
But
that's slightly different though, because that's an action you've done a lot. So these mortgage computation things, this is something you haven't done a lot.
I mean, we get into specifics of this, whether you could do the computation very quickly and with a one track and one algorithm, whether you compare several. I don't know that specifically, but here I think there's a lot of work going that the habit systems versus the deliberative systems are really different. And that now in this route imagined example, the driving example, suddenly you put a block, a detour. I can't take my familiar route. What happens to me then? Well, I can't carry on my conversation with a passenger or on the phone anymore. You're not supposed to talk on the phone when you're driving, but confession. I can't carry the conversation. I got to think. And what happens? I feel what happens is my cognitive map pops up. And I say, where am I? And what are the possible alternative routes that aren't my familiar routes? And if I have a good enough cognitive map, I might be able to come up with a good route. I try a few in my mind and try executing one of them. So
now we just use Google Maps, so we don't have to do that anymore. Are going waste away.
Right, but so that maybe I'm old-fashioned guy, but that's my model. In the automatic processing mode.
But look, this happened to me the other day where I was on the sub. This is not the other day. This is before the pandemic. But I was on the subway. I was reading a book, and the subway stopped, and it was my stop, and I didn't even realize it. I kind of vaguely remember hearing the ding dong, sound of the doors opening or whatever. And the next thing I know, I was walking down the stairs, and I was like still reading my book, and I looked up, and I was like going down the stairs at the subway station. I was like, where the hell am I? I realized I was at the right stop, actually. So
it was correct.
It was exactly the right stop. And I had navigated the stairs. I was kind of just following people, or wasn't even aware I was really walking. I was like surprised that I was on the stairs. So that sort of stuff happens a lot, I think. But sometimes you notice the detour consciously, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes it says detour and you get off the highway
Oh, sometimes they
And
have
then
little markers and say turn left. They give you landmarks, but
yeah, and
sometimes
then you
it's
realize all of a sudden, oh, where am I? So I hear this line a lot. And by the way, I'm not denying that consciousness has a function. I'm not making that argument. I'm simply thinking that
yeah.
it's an
I
open
always think of
question.
you. I think of you as a
Open
fairly
question.
reasonable person.
Thank you. I mean, I know more hardline people than me that think that it's more conclusively demonstrable that there's no function for consciousness. I'm not like that, but I do think it's an open question, because what opens the question is that we do a lot of this stuff unconsciously. And so when you see the rat do it, the behavior is compatible with something that you do consciously, maybe. But if it can be done unconsciously, then there's a question about what does consciousness add to it. And maybe what you're saying is right, that it adds flexibility or problem solving abilities. But everything that people suggest, you can find examples of those things being done unconsciously.
Yep.
And there's a more general line of thinking which just says, look, the content of this stuff is what's really important. It's what it represents. And those things can occur consciously or not. So the important part is the part that's independent of it being conscious. And for anything that you specify, it's the representational content of the states that's doing the work, how it's related to the world. And that could happen consciously or unconsciously, so that the animal could not be a robot. It could be a responsive, flexible, computing organism, and yet do it in a way that everything was unconscious.
Yeah,
or do you think that's not a possibility?
I think I'm only aware of one conscious entity for sure, and that's me. I'm not even sure you're conscious. So it's hard to know what the possibilities are. And whether the rats are conscious or my dog is, these are just guesses. And we're forced to make them. There's the extreme cautionary view that we can't infer consciousness in non-human animals because we can't talk to them. So the conservative point of view is, let's assume that they're not conscious. And I have pet dogs, and I see the amazing behavioral flexibility they have, their ability to anticipate the future and to try to get you to do what they want you to do. And it's there's certainly this deliberation that's there, this concern about the future, that kind of thing. So let me get.
I mean, dogs might be a special case, though, just to interject. Dogs might be a special case because of their coevolution with humans.
Yeah, right.
So, they've spent a lot of time with us, and they're like one of the few animals that care about our gaze direction and care about pleasing us. Like other animals don't have those traits. So dogs might be an exception. But take your typical rat. I understand what you're saying. Rats, they have all these behaviors. But I mean, I believe that rats are conscious personally. That extends at least to mammals. But I still think there's a methodological question, which is what would count as evidence that would convince a skeptic. And there, I think that it's harder to make a case if you have a real diehard skeptic.
Yeah, I don't think I can do that. But what I can do is give you a behavioral system that has a lot of nice features, that has a deliberative feature and some others and that corresponds really nicely in a one-to-one way with our introspective sense of consciousness. Yeah. And so I think it's a much more appealing, intuitive notion of what and I think I can explain some of these low, subconscious effects pretty reasonably well without breaking the model. So what's another feature of this high-level system is that it's integrated in whole body. It involves all of you. These other systems, it's about behavioral choices that involve your entire body, not just how you move your arm or some sort of subsystem. It's in total body decision-making. So it involves a sense of self, a sense of outside world. It involves some sort of what's called an allocentric representation of self with respect. There's all sorts of features that are part of this sort of high-level decision-making system that we're sort of probing that correspond pretty nicely to what should be in a conscious system. Right. Agency, there's, how I can affect the world and make a change for ways that are good for me or my family or the world, whatever. All those things are things we want to put into a conscious deliberative system. I don't think agency is part of some of these lower level systems or the integration, those sorts of things. And so you add together these features you would like to have in this operational system, and then see how well it fits with what we think about consciousness. And I'm not going to break down the hard problem and say, oh yeah, we solved it. think that's very close. But I can make these two models come close together and get as close as possible. Get pretty close, I think.
I mean, I think the hard problem is a different question. So the hard problem is, from philosophy, obviously, is the question of why is there consciousness at all, basically. So that's why is any physical process accompanied by consciousness, or, that's, I think, the essence of the hard problem. That's a different question. I don't think we need to answer that question to do science. Maybe it'll have an answer, maybe it won't. Maybe we'll have some, I mean, certain theories of consciousness will give you an answer. So maybe we need to figure out what theory is best suited, and then come back to the hard problem. But the question that we're talking about is more like circumscribed than that. So if you just look at theories of consciousness, like neurobiological theories, so like IIT or global workspace theory, or even the higher order theory, which I spent some time thinking about.
Yeah.
But I think about all these theories of consciousness. So I write about some. Mostly, I mean, if you don't know me, I defend the higher order theory mostly because everyone attacks it. So I say, hey, it's not that bad, guys. It's not that I really think it's true.
I didn't know your motivation. Now I know your motivation.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a funny story. When I was in grad school, I mean, probably no one cares, but when I first read a paper by David Rosenthal, actually, I was an undergraduate, and I just thought it was the most outlandish thing I ever heard. I was like, this is just ridiculous. Like being conscious, just having a thought, like, it's this guy ever taken LSD or like, anything? but of course, and then I remember I brought it up in class. I was like, this is so wild and it just can't be true. And my teacher, a guy named Kent Bach, who's a philosopher guy, he was like, oh, I'll tell him that you said that. And I was like, oh. Turns out they knew each other, but this was the first time I really became aware that like philosophers were still alive and that these weren't like all the old dead people like before, like Plato and Kant and so forth. But anyway, so my first reaction to the higher order theory, at least in that version of it, was like, this is just ludicrous. But then I gradually became convinced that no, actually, it's not completely ludicrous. It's not obviously false. You can say some things. And so, but the response that I kept getting from other people was the one that I had. Oh, it's obviously false. So I spent a lot of time saying, look, it's got things that are going for it. That doesn't mean that I ultimately think that it's the one true theory. I think we don't know. I think there's a lot that we don't know. And we're still in a delicate stage where we don't know the right balance between theory and data, right? You need both. You need theories to make sense of the data. You need data to construct the theories. But right now, there's a lot of both, a lot of theories, a lot of data. It's not clear what directions any of this stuff is really pointing, except in very circumscribed cases.
I'm thinking back to the interview you did with Joe Ledoux and David Rosenthal.
Yeah.
And I've been resistant to what I understood of the higher order theories. But in the interview, I ended up agreeing with David Rosenthal almost all the time. And my favorite thing that I remember from that was him saying, I just don't understand it, what it's like to be idea of what consciousness is. And I've always struggled with that as well. So it doesn't, what it's like, that doesn't seem, it's not intuitively meaningful to me. That's just an aside, but I did find that attractive.
I mean, so he's got particular motivation for saying that. So, I mean, to me, that's a fundamental idea, which introduces the core concept of the explanandum, the thing that we're all trying to understand and explain. So I think it makes a sense. Certainly when I was introduced to that way of thinking, it made sense to me that there was something that it was like to be me, and that there's nothing that it's like to be the lamppost. So that contrast seems intuitively clear to me. And when I say that there's something that it's like to be me, what we mean is just that from my point of view, there's a way things appear. There's an external environment located in a certain orientation. There are objects that I think are reachable and some which I think are not. So they're just, you can also say things about, redness. I know you have a beef with that, but so there are the various qualitative features, sounds, taste, colors, but also like graspability. I can see right now there's a book on my desk. I could grab it from here if I wanted to. I could tell that it's reachable. Those are all facts about what it's like to be me, which I think are ordinary facts that when you talk to people, we talk this way, just experience.
We just said, the last thing you said I really do like, which is the agency aspect of what I can and can't do. There's a book there I can reach, or I can try to reach, that kind of thing. That's, I think, a core embedded thing. Personal identity, agency, self, non-self. These are all aspects of this higher order representation that should be included. And
But then you know what it's like talk refers to. It refers to the sum total of all that stuff.
Well, okay, no, I'm pretty dumb. It takes me to learn a while to learn new things,
Okay.
and I have a lot
We call
problems
that
with
being
lots
careful in philosophy. There's a lot of careful thinkers, John.
and I try to take advantage of that, because when I finally get something, it sort of sticks pretty well. But it
Yeah,
takes me
that's
a while.
good.
So maybe what it's like to be is one of those things.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
it's, so that's how I get into it. It's the notion of experience. We all have experience.
Here's a question I have for you, which I
Yeah.
posed on Twitter, and we're dealing with memory and consciousness. So I posed this on Twitter just at a sort of a lark, and I said, if you don't have a memory, if an organ doesn't have any memory, can it be conscious? And I assumed everyone's going to say, of course it can be conscious. We know these amnestics are, but most people said no. Without memory, there's no consciousness. What do you think?
Well, so what do you mean by consciousness? You mean that
Yeah. I mean,
that
that's
there's
part of the
not
issue.
something that it's like for the organism? So could there be an instantaneous experience? No, I think an experience unfolds in time, which is partially where the memory thing comes from. But you would have to be able to, well, I don't want to say at least recognize, I guess, the experience, which is going to require some memory abilities. So you think you could just have the experience without having any memory at all?
Right. There's a constant flow of something called experience, but it disappears as soon as you have it. And there's no looking forward, no looking back. It's just instantaneous. Tough. And then you just compare that also with the driving example, where clearly as I'm driving home in an automatic pilot, I'm making sensory behavioral responses. And if you stop me at a moment, you say, what are you thinking? I would probably be able to report it pretty well.
Yeah.
But not uncommonly, the experience similar to what you had, it's going frequently. It doesn't have any permanent residue in any way. And it's as if it wasn't experienced.
Well, I mean, it depends. So memory doesn't mean episodic memory. I wasn't thinking. So I don't know the way people are interpreting the question on Twitter.
I don't know either. I just threw it out.
But because, we have iconic memory. So,
I meant declarative memory. I didn't mean behavior patterns and things like that.
Okay, because that's what I was going to say. So that might count as memory. And so once you get down to like, what if you just mean information retention or something like that?
No,
that was sort of more on the lines along which I was thinking that you would need memory. But so in philosophy, there's a related question, which is, can you have experience without concepts? So I think the way a lot of philosophers use the word concept is sort of synonymous with the way a lot of neuroscientists and psychologists use the word memory, especially semantic memory, so that you have to recall these things and give them names and name the items, like is that a screwdriver or a fruit or whatever. So there's a whole debate in philosophy about whether you could have non-conceptual content to experience, or whether content always involves categorizing it or something like that. So
I haven't given much thought to this, but in the path way of thinking about things, does the environment have to be a concept, and does the items along the path have to have conceptual, be chunked and categorized or not? I'd have to think about that to come. But the rough notion I get from the very distant view of philosophy, the idea that consciousness and language are so coexistent. Without language, that seems silly to me. But I'll leave it to you guys.
Well, that's a different claim. So, I certainly think mice are conscious. There's something that's like to be a mouse, but they don't have language, and infants too probably, but they don't have language. So I think that the more respectable version of that, and the one that I would actually take serious and entertain, is the idea that language can shape your experience in a different way. So that I think that while it's the case that rats probably experience something like fear, they don't experience what we call fear because they don't have that concept and the concept of danger that we do.
Well, the fear, so the whole fear story is so complicated.
Yeah.
As I said earlier on, I got into this largely to understand emotion. So I'm sort of been a bystander trying to figure that out. About 10 years ago, I was really pleased that it looked like the various fear people were coming to a consensus. But now it's gone apart. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's gone apart in wild ways.
So what was the consensus? You mean the sort of subcortical model of conscious
I thought it was Lisa Feldman.
Barrett.
Yeah, she had a nice review article. I think it was 2005 annual reviews of psychology and neuroscience. And there were a few other papers coming out around the same time, almost saying the same kind of thing. It certainly wasn't James Lange thing, but it was sort of looking back, what did I just experience, forming a concept based on it, and also having some hedonic value to it. It was good. I forget the term that used that. It seemed to coalesce along those lines. It seemed pretty solid and reasonable. But now the arguments that I just could, whether it's a behavioral, whether consciousness is behavior, whether emotion is behavior, whether it's internal feeling. Joe Ledoux, has said recently, fear is a feeling, and I like that. But I don't, the next steps I don't like so much. But I just see the whole discussion is coming complicated and apart. There's no. You see a consensus? I don't know that.
Well, part of what you're saying is the cognitivist theories of emotions, which were sort of fighting against this Darwin notion that there are these basic emotions which we share with our animal siblings or whatever. And so a large part of the stuff you're talking about was trying to, as a counterpoint to that, was suggesting that the emotions are mostly cognitively constructed. There is no such thing as fear that you're born with. Rather, you have to learn what is dangerous and your concept of fear.
So let me describe a model for fear as I would like to see it, or something, as a deliberative process. Okay, you see the bear in the woods, and you run, and you're not conscious of it. You're the emotional behavior is there, but there's no emotion yet because you're just in automatic pilot mode. And that's, I think, what Joe Ledoux argues, that there's this low-level survival circuit that gets you away from that bear. Okay.
Exactly.
So now you climb a tree and you feel a little safe. And then you say, bears can climb trees. I'm not really safe. and and you give yourself, but you feel you got 30 seconds to deal with things. And now you, fear is the motivation to get away from the bear. And then you deliberate about possible, should I run this direction? If I go up the hill, should I drop it? If I have some food, can I drop it? And you maybe think of some strategies that might be alternatives. And so I think of fear as a conscious motivational state that is the grounding for deriving strategies to deal with that state.
Yeah, I think that sounds fine to me. Obviously fear is involved with motivation, but the question is, where in the brain are these processes taking place?
Okay, so
how do we understand what the
old arguments that
is it the amygdala, is it the cortex?
Yeah, I don't care. That's not, I'm in the hippocampus. It's not in the hippocampus. As long as it's not hippocampus, they can settle that. It doesn't have to be localized.
Well, flashbulb memories involve the hippocampus, right? These kind of emotional, traumatic memories.
Oh, yeah. No, that probably does involve the hippocampus. And contextual fear conditioning, that's a big literature. And that brings up the term context again. And that's where this map-like thing comes up. And it gets into complicated splitting hair issues, but we probably don't have the time or wherewithal to go there.
I agree with what you're saying about fear. So obviously I've written papers with Joe, and I think I know his perspective, and I'm not 100% committed to it or against it. I think it's an important and interesting view, aligns with the higher order theory in important ways, which I think is interesting. And mostly with that paper that we wrote, we were trying to get people to have this conversation, which you don't like, but we were trying to get people to join discussions that were going on in the literature on consciousness and discussions that were going on in the literature on emotions, which were going along separately, but were really overlapping. And that was the debate over a first order versus higher order theory. So in the emotion literature, you have exactly this debate, the one that you're describing, between people like Lisa Feldman Barrett and, on the other hand, Jaaks Panksepp, who thinks that fear is in the amygdala, and then people like Lisa who are going to say it's in the cortex somewhere. It's a constructed state. And so there was this debate basically that was going on between these two camps, and it maps on pretty much directly to the debates which you find going on in consciousness literature about, not specifically about emotions, but just in general about whether cortex or subcortical areas are where the neural correlates of consciousness are going to be found. And that in turn itself maps onto the question about first order, higher order theory. So there's all these debates which were concurrently going on, but not really talking to each other. So that was part of our main goal, was to say, here's our model, something that we think is interesting, but also just to get the conversation going, because we think this is an important issue. And, so I think largely there's like a terminological issue in that debate, which is whatever's going on in the hippocampus, or excuse me, the amygdala, you could call that unconscious fear processing, or you could call it a survival network or danger detector. The semantics of it may be important or whatever, but it's the same states that everyone's talking about. There's some states in there that are tracking danger, that are cueing your behavior and so forth and so on. And then that can happen without consciousness though. So when you see the snake subliminally, the amygdala is still activated. And I don't know about all these deliberative paths. That would be interesting to find out. So I'm not sure if that's going to activate escape routes and things of that nature. My guess is that
those are pretty good, doable kinds of experiments, I think.
Yeah.
Put it in different frameworks in humans and monkeys and rats, and see if you can see evidence of deliberation in certain times. Obviously, we're not going to design a perfect experiment now, but I think those are practical.
So you could look at that, and then you would have some evidence about whether these kinds of processes could be done unconsciously, whether they're activated by stimuli which are not perceived. So I don't know, but anyway, so that would be sort of what the issue would. And I always like it when abstract philosophical ideas can have some kind of connection to empirically tractable results. So this might be one of those areas that'd be interesting to find out. And I'd be happy resting, this idea on an empirical kind of claim like that, whether there is this unconscious deliberative process. So anyway, okay.
Can I stir up a couple of more enemies before we finish? Yes. And so there are a number of threads of neuroscientists trying to explain consciousness. And I don't like the endpoint being perception. That is when perceptual awareness. And I would like it linked to action. And you could name a whole number of people who say, oh, now there's a conscious percept, that's consciousness. I think, as I've been sort of trying to push, you have to put it into an action framework. And the many, many areas where I think that's missing. So the visual system is so highly studied.
So I was just going to say is that with the visual system is so highly studied, partially though, because we're very visual animals.
Right.
A large part of the brain is devoted. There's more part of the brain devoted to vision than there is to action. Right. So that's significant. Action is important.
So the strategy I've used is sort of an animal pseudo-evolutionary argument of looking at core functions. And so you can say in people, starting with people, you're going to be misguided by how big the visual system is. Because it's so complicated, it's a difficult job. And its size and overwhelmingness makes you think that's the whole end of the story. But if you look at core functions, the core functions will be linked to action. So pain is I think a better model qualia or whatever than red, where pain you can see the connection to action much more readily. I think you could make the argument for red as well, but that's a little less clear cut. So that's the.
There is a good story there. Primates use colors basically to distinguish ripe fruits from unripe ones.
Right. Or those qualia are open for flexible learning. So you might not be born with the predisposition, but you learn to hate blueberries or something like that. And so the side of those sorts of things. So at least they're flexible, they're tags in which flexible things could be answered. Could be.
Yeah. So I think part of the problem is this whole issue that we've been talking about for the last while is this notion of how it connects to the function. So everyone agrees that when you perceive something red, that you're having a conscious experience.
Right.
And that well, I guess it doesn't work, because I was going to say, then when you unconsciously perceive it, that you're not having a conscious experience. But there are people who debate that. Actually, that's the overflow debate. So that's not even safe. So you get the same problems with the with the redness. But I get what you're saying, is that you wish people focus more on this kind of feeling of agency and action, motivational states, as opposed to it kind of motivationally inert states. Because I take part of the point that you're making is very important, which is that it's kind of easy to get people to see this, oh, could your red be the same as my blue, right? You can, if you work at it a little bit, people will come to understand what you're talking about, that, oh, maybe we both call it blue, but to you it looks yellow. But you say that it's blue, and so you could get people to all. And some people naturally discover. I mean, when I teach this to the undergrads, some students are like, yeah, I thought of that when I was a teenager. Other students are like, I don't understand, but then over time come to see it. So, but eventually you can get people in that ballpark. But if you try the same thing with pain, they don't come around. So it's like, could your pleasure be what I feel when I feel pain? And yet you still smile and you go around and say, oh, this is delicious, even though when you're eating the cake, it feels like someone's stabbing you with needles inside your mouth. It's like people they resist that very, very much to the extreme. They're like, no, that's not something conceivable. Now, of course, really principled people in this area, they do take that route. So when I asked David Chalmers this question, he said, yeah, it's conceivable that your pain be my pleasure and we be inverts in that way, and yet behave identically. Not true of our world, that, like all of this weird conceivable stuff, it's in some possible world. But so if there are people who have really consistently tried to take that line, but I think the average person finds that to be very strange, that you feel pain but smile, or that you feel pleasure.
Another example, a personal example I like of linking percepts to behavior and experience was a single personal experience when I was about 15 or 16, and getting quite drunk on beer, and throwing up all night, and hangover the next day and stuff. And for maybe 3 years, the smell of beer made me nauseous, and I couldn't walk into a bar or something. We traveled in Ireland, a pub and stuff. I didn't hate it, but I certainly wouldn't go. I couldn't approach those places. I really wanted to be able to drink beer again, but that clearly a sensory behavioral was a link that was made. I wasn't born with it, but it was always there for the linkage to be made. And I think that that's another single clear example where is your smell of beer the same as mine? Well, I've got nauseous and you don't, and the smell seems identifiable, but the input.
So you think the smell changed? Because so you might say that
no,
the smell was the same, but it just had different links.
I think so.
So the smell, our experience of the smell of the beer might still be the same, even though. Say again.
It felt like the same. I wouldn't have called it a different smell.
Yeah, so that's not the case. So the case that I was imagining was like, your yellow is my blue. So here, it's the same experience in both cases. Just so the smell is the same. It's just now having new.
But it's possible linkage to behaviors. It was there all along for a possible linkage. It may never have occurred, but in this case, a strong one was linked, and it became an action.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's important, because there's this culture that we have of reacting to behaviorism. And we tell this nice story about, and part of it is that place cells, I think, are a large part of that. So there's always the famous Chomsky review or whatever. But it also, like the things that we're talking about, is that you ruled out all of the options besides cognitive maps. So there's no stimulus response story you can tell that makes sense of all the data that we have about rats and mazes. So there's got to be some cognitive mechanism that's going on in there. So, anyway, so there's this story about our reaction to behaviorism, and the triumph of cognitivism in general, cognitive neuroscience in particular in this case. But there's a tendency to overreact, I think, sometimes, and to throw out some of the important insights that behaviorists had, which was. To some extent is what we're talking about here. So there are tremendous connections between behavior and our understanding of mental states. Maybe there's always something left over, and you can't analyze behavior completely, and mental states completely in terms of behavior, and you can't do science that way. You need to appeal to internal mechanisms and so forth. But there are strong connections between our mental state notions and the behavioral criterion of them. And no more is that more clear than when we talk about animals, like we were talking about before. When you see the dog's behavior, it's almost impossible not to associate the mental state that goes along with it, because there is this tight connection in our thinking. And behaviors really made, they did us a service, sort of, in philosophy and psychology, although they're slightly different movements. But they did us a service by pointing out how far you could go just by talking about behavior, how strong the connections really are. And one of the things that talking about red as opposed to these other motivational states really does a disservice. Another way in which it does a disservice is that it fosters this idea that there is this kind of easy separation between the mental and behavioral notions, which makes it appear easier to imagine zombies and inverts and things like Dennett that he doesn't like. But so, I think you're right that focusing more on these cases is going to help. So I'm definitely on board with that.
Good. We come to total agreement.
Yeah, we come to total agreement. I mean, I still don't think that you're going to get a first order theory out of this. So I think you're going to have to supplement it with, I don't know. It's very hard for me to understand the first order theories generally, that there's consciousness, but no one knows about it. To me, that I'm kind of, I find that to be very mysterious.
So my challenge to you is the value in a second order theory. What does the animal or the human gain from having the second order representation? I think I'm coming aboard with some of the ideas, but I'd like to know the function.
Yeah, so it's a possibility that there is no function. I think that's something you have to admit, that if the theory were true, that it's possible that I have no function. On the other hand, it's whatever function the higher order states have. So if they end up having a function, then so one thing you might think is, look, if you like your story about deliberation, how is it that when they're in this deliberative process, you're not aware of yourself as doing all this deliberation? There's a sense in which you're doing it, you're aware of it when it's going on consciously. Or do you not agree with that? Sort of just from your point of view, doesn't it seem that way?
I'm not quite sure. I think I was agreeing that there are probably levels of the nervous system where something like deliberation takes place like cerebellar modeling or something of that sort, where various actions are considered before one is selected. I'm not such an expert in those areas, but it certainly seems reasonable. It doesn't mean, I'm just sort of positing.
No, I was talking about the other end. So when you are engaged in this deliberative process consciously,
right,
it seems like that to you. It seems like you are engaged in that deliberative process. So it seems to me like it's part of the nature of the experience, part of, if you sort of focus on the content of it, that there's this reflective aspect there.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects of deliberation is a sort of a working memory component. So if you try out several alternatives, you have to keep several of them in mind, even if it was tried out, a couple of seconds ago, and you have to evaluate the alternatives in some form before you make a decision. So you have to be at some higher level awareness that you are in a deliberative mode. That fits what you're saying.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So it seems like almost a conceptual claim that if you sort of think about the experience that you have, that you see that it has this reflective component to it. And that's part of the explanation of how the state gets to be the way that it is.
On the other hand, I'm not so sure that you say, I am having this experience, as opposed to, you just sort of, in a sense, you're aware of the alternatives, but whether I am the one who's assessing these alternatives as opposed to some other mind, I don't know that that's what's going on.
You don't. So you think that when you have experiences like that it's an open question whose experience it is?
Well, it's yours, but you don't sit back and say, this is my experience. I think you have to hold this deliberative notion with holding these alternatives somewhat parallel in mind before making a selection. But whether that means that you are so super aware that you're deliberating, you sort of are.
Why super aware? Why couldn't you just be like, there's a peripheral sense in which it's you're aware of it, but it's not. Yeah, so I think that part of the resistance that people have to the higher order view is that they think that there's this grandiose notion of me sitting back surveying the mental states.
Right.
But it may be a relatively automatic metacognitive process that's not very effortless.
If someone poked you and said, "What are you thinking about?" You said, "Well, I'm thinking about which route to take home." And you could probably jump out and describe that to somebody.
Right. Exactly. So, and people like Rosenthal have argued that that's part of an argument for the existence of the higher order states that we posit, so that the fact that you can report it in that way suggests that you are aware of the mental state. So there's the higher order state. You can say, I'm in this state or whatever. But anyway, so, I'm not here to try to convince you. I'm just, my main goal is to get people to think about these issues.
Yeah.
And so, not everyone's going to agree about the higher order theory, but I do think that it's worth taking seriously and shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. So what I was suggesting was that part of the reason why you might like it is because there's this sense in which it explains how you do the deliberation, what consciousness would add to it that makes it more useful. It would add this sense of awareness of yourself as doing the task, which seems like it would be hard to do otherwise. But anyway, that's speculative, and who knows?
Maybe we can begin to wrap this up with wrapping back to something you brought up in the very, very beginning.
Okay.
And that was, what are these oscillations about?
Yeah.
And my suspicion is that consciousness will involve lots of your brain, and they have to be somewhat talking to each other and synchronized, not just, say, the little part of the hippocampus doing one thing in the frontal, but somehow they have to be tied together at some level. And there's an emergence when enough of the brain takes over. We have little evidence that you have several conscious processing going on at once. It seems like one. And
Right.
if there were these little islands doing it, then why couldn't you have several? So my guess is that the synchrony thing you were talking about earlier is real important, and will be a key to unraveling some of this stuff.
Yeah, I agree that synchrony stuff is going to be important. I mean, even if it's not important in the consciousness part, it's clearly important in the other part of the story, which is the binding problem, things of that nature, which is going to at least explain the content, if not the consciousness itself, would explain what we're conscious of.
So one of the phenomena of consciousness is it's one at a time.
Yeah.
And how do that's a biological, that's a constraint that's really there. I mean, unless people say, oh, I can be, I can think about, I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. I know I always have this argument with my students about multitasking. They're like, no, professor, we really multitask. Like, no, you don't. You serially switch really quick. They're like, no, we're doing it at the same time. Like, no, you're not. But anyway, so it does seem that way, right? Subjectively, it's like you're doing both at the same time. It's like, actually, it's not in parallel. But anyway, so I mean, I'm someone who likes to explore the ideas. So I like thinking about these issues and the different different trade-offs that the theories have to make. But that's mostly what I'm in the game for. I think it's an open question. I do think the higher order theory has some advantages over some other particular theories. Like, I think it's more plausible than IIT, for example. But IIT is something that's, it's also some people like. So I don't know. I certainly don't want to be viewed as someone who's like thinks, oh, we know for sure this is the way things are. I think it's an exciting time to be doing any of this sort of stuff. I do wish that some of these, patches of success would be quilted into a more coherent structure. So I do wonder, sort of at the end, what do you think, sort of wrapping up full signal, what do you think is the future of cognitive neuroscience, as in terms of it being a discipline, which is a kind of unique and distinct part of the neurosciences in general?
That's a tough question. One of the issues is which tools we have. And there's some emerging tools that are for cognitive neuroscience. So one of the sets of tools we've paid a lot of attention to is recording of neurons in the brain and how they opened up a new approach. Another is functional imaging, which is almost totally separate and independent. And I'm not an expert there, but these are approach. Then there are others. Lots of tools give you avenues for making connections. I pursue the neuron and neuron network approach to how it helps think about things, and it brings things closer together. To me, it helps to have these almost as metaphors for how things are likely to work. It's a real instantiation of something that gives the behavioral properties that we're looking for. Whether it is the thing, it's the way I tend to think about them. I don't get so much out of the fMRI stuff. It doesn't help.
Do you think they're both part of the same field?
Oh yeah.
Is there?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't think those linkages have been made very well, but they will be made.
So it's just when you
But
say you don't get very much out of it, what you mean is that for the questions you want to ask, it's not a good tool for
well,
answering.
the papers I read haven't said, that's a new thing that I got to tie into my theories of how things work. Doesn't work that way so much.
Yeah.
No, it's certainly, digging tunnels from two different directions. You hope they meet, but they haven't met yet. And, you're in the path, and maybe you'll meet, maybe not.
Okay.
If they don't meet,
then we'll just keep digging.
yeah. So you have
Okay.
multiple tunnels.
Yeah.
They're come together.
I mean, I guess that kind of was you answered what I was asking, but what I was asking was like, do you think cognitive neuroscience is a discipline that's here to stay? Is
Oh
it being
yeah.
assimilated into the mainstream neuroscience, or is it still a kind
Oh
of
yeah.
distinctive
Yeah.
process?
So let me just give you a little historical context if we have time for that. So
Yeah.
I think roughly when I was starting the formidable and impressive serious neuroscience was close to the sensory end and the motor ends of things, where you could sort of work out serial processing and get an understanding at the, how motor neurons lead to muscle contraction, that side of things, or in stretch receptors and understanding the stimulus response profiles and moving upstream slowly. I think the Nobel Prize talks were the Mosers and O'Keefe. I think Mosers did more of a job of saying how O'Keefe put an electrode right in the middle of the brain. Everyone said that's the stupidest approach imaginable. That'll never get you anywhere. And you've got to either do this moving from the outside approach, or else we'll never learn about the brain works. And lo and behold, he made a big discovery. And I think it's something that's really built from that. So that, and I think the change in the whole field of neuroscience from like 40 years ago to now is very, very dramatic. That people understand you just don't build, in a reductionist framework from the periphery on in and lead to understanding. It sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes putting electrode in the middle will give you a piece of gold that you can follow. Most of the time, but the few pieces of gold are worth it.
Yeah. And do you see like consciousness science as an important part of that, or as someone who's interested in, it has a career in cognitive neuroscience your whole life, and now you're interested in consciousness. Do you think science of consciousness as a separate and distinct part of this project, or an outlier?
Oh yeah, no, I thought Koch's book Quest for Consciousness was wonderful. DeHane's more recent book was also very, really, really good. And I think those are powerful. Yeah, right. Consciousness, and though I don't read that literature all that carefully, but yeah, I think that those are. I think that my objection to each of them is they're too much on the perceptual side, not on the action side. But yeah, no, I think that things are moving.
Well, that's good. Because some people worry about. I've always been hopeful that consciousness would sort of do what attention did, and sort of become a mainstream area in its own right, where there are people do, you can get a career, get grants, and have a lab, and sort of be a reputable person.
Well, if you can explain attention to me, I'd appreciate it.
Really? Yeah. Well, I didn't know that was a requirement. What do you got against attention? I guess that's a whole separate conversation we have to have.
Yeah, not for me. I can talk about 5 minutes on attention, then I'm done. Yeah, attention and consciousness, there's a big topic. Whether that's the key, I don't know.
Yeah, they're okay. Interesting. All right. Well, I hate to break this up because I'm having a fun time talking with you, but I do have a nap time, which is about to end downstairs. So I do have to start wrapping this up. But I do wonder if there's anything which hasn't come up, which you were hoping would come up. So is there anything?
I wrote you an email and I mentioned about 5 really different topics, and 4 of them didn't come up. So yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at this. It covers a lot.
Okay. Well, we'll have you back. If you're game, you come back. We'll talk about those other 4 topics.
Okay. Yeah. We have time on our hands as we're in pandemic mode.
Yeah, exactly. That is for sure. There's no doubt about that. I got the rest of the summer. All right, John. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I had a great time talking with you. It was fun. I think this is the first time I've ever talked with you for a long period of time like this. So I've seen you, like we said, a couple of times in New York and on Twitter a lot. But it's nice to talk with you in more depth and to get to know what you're thinking about.
Right.
I really like your work and know your approach. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been terrific.
Okay. So we're ending the... Okay.
I heard a question